check, check, 1 2 1 2, 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 check, check, 1 2 1 2. I'm waiting for you. Check, check, 1 2. Hey. Check, 1 2, test.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Kira Foley-Tusman. I am the Chief Admin Officer of the Union League Legacy Foundation. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the League with the mission to inspire and educate League members, general community, and students to be educated, engaged, and responsible citizens. One of the ways that we do that, of course, is programs like this evening. We also do civics education programs for high school students. We provide scholarship aid to scholars. This year, we presented a remarkable 15 scholars with almost $500,000 in scholarship aid. I'm thrilled to, thank you. Yes, that definitely deserves a round of applause. And I am thrilled to acknowledge a special guest in our audience, Juliana Vlaspoulos. Juliana, where are you? Stand up, yes. Juliana is one of our incoming scholars, so she'll be attending Jefferson University this fall. Thank you. All of the work of the Legacy Foundation is made possible through voluntary contributions. So thank you for those who have already so generously contributed. And if you have not and you'd like to correct that tonight, we'd be happy to help you do so. Kristen Moran, our Director of Development, is in the back of the room, or of course, I would be happy to help you with that as well. For tonight's program, it will run just about an hour in length. The last portion of that hour will be a Q&A session. We will have wireless mics. Please make sure that if you are asking a question that you have one of those wireless mics. We are streaming tonight, and that will ensure that we have the best program possible for those who are joining us virtually. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, historian Jim Mundy.
Thank you, Karen, and thank everybody for coming out tonight. This is a really great, an hour ago it was pouring, and we thought, who's going to show up? And now we know. So thank you all for being here. We really do appreciate it. So Jack actually gave me the option of making up his biography. So I had this I thought, okay, he's the illegitimate ancestor of Charles Macalester, thrice removed. And I thought, no, I better not go down that path. So I'll read what Jack gave me just so I don't get in trouble. So Jack McCarthy is a longtime Philadelphia archivist and historian who has held leadership positions at several area historical institutions and directed a number of major archives and public history projects. Jack specializes in 3 areas of Philadelphia history: music, business, and industry, and Northeast Philadelphia. And if you ever, Jack knows his business and industry in Northeast Philly, but he's one of the great jazz experts in the city. If anybody likes jazz, talk to Jack afterwards. He'll tell you all about it. Jack regularly writes lectures and gives tours in these subjects and has curated exhibits and consulted on documents on them, including an exhibit at the Union League as well. So Jack, we've got a good relationship with Jack. Jack is also the president of the Friends of Northeast Philadelphia History. And so it is my great pleasure and honor to say, Mr. McCarthy, please welcome to the lectern. Enjoy it. Have fun.
Thank you, Jim. Pleasure to be here. I was here, 6 years ago, doing a series of lectures on Torresdale history. It's great to be back. I was telling somebody earlier, I grew up about a mile from here, and my one and only experience with the Torresdale, I think it was the Torresdale Frankfurt Country Club at that time. A lot of my friends were caddies here, and they make extra money. And I was maybe 11, 12, and they convinced me to come and try it. And I came and I sat in the caddy room forever, and all the regular caddies were selected because all the golfers had their favorites, and I just sat and sat and sat. And I said, the heck with this, I'm going home. And I never came back. So that was my, yeah, finally I made it back, right? So anyway, but the Torresdale Country Club was a part of my life growing up. As I said, I lived just a mile from here. And then over the years, I got involved in local history, and this program tonight is one of the areas that I'm interested in, Torresdale history. And before I get into the body of the talk, I want to just take a minute and give a shout out to our local history group, the Friends of Northeast Philadelphia History, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to preserve and promote our local history. And we do a number of things, but the big thing that we do is, or the most public thing we do is we have these monthly meetings the first Wednesday of every month on local history, except for July and August, where we have presentations on local history, and all local historians and history lovers gather. We usually meet at Pennypack Baptist Church in Bustleton. It's free. There's no membership. There's no registration. There's nothing. You just show up. We have the slide got a little distorted here, but the way we communicate with everybody is through our email list, which is nephillyhistory@gmail.com, or through the Facebook page of the Northeast Philadelphia History Network. If you follow the Facebook page or sign up for our emails, you'll get notices of our meetings. And in addition to meeting at the church and having these programs, we sometimes meet at local historic sites to tour them and learn about them. And so our meeting in September, which is the first Wednesday, September 7th, we're meeting at the Shrine of the True Cross Chapel, which was built by the Drexel family in 1924. It's now part of Jefferson Torresdale Hospital. And this building is going to come up later in my talk, but if you want to get to see it inside and learn about it, just show up there at 6:30 on September 7th. And the last thing I want to talk about with our friends of Northeast Philadelphia History is we have a Northeast Philadelphia History Fair every other year, where dozens of local historical groups and sites and museums and historical societies come and exhibit. Hundreds of people show up, and it's just a day for sharing Northeast history. And the next one is April 13th, Saturday, at Constadter's down the road here. And then I'm showing, this is a photograph of our board being honored by City Council 5 years ago. But the person on the far left, Charlie Macalester, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, did a tremendous amount of research on Torresdale, a lot of which I've incorporated into this talk. And then the person third from the left is my wife, Patty, who couldn't be here tonight, but also has done a tremendous amount of research on Torresdale history. And she's tuning in through the remote broadcast of this. So hi, Patty. Everybody say hi to Patty. I'm sure she's embarrassed now. Anyway, between her and Charlie Macalester, they were the ones that really gathered all the raw material, all the detail. I'm the one that sort of formulated it into this presentation, but they're the real experts. So anyway, I want to acknowledge their efforts. So on to the talk itself. I'm going to talk about the pre-Torresdale era, which is, there was no Torresdale per se prior to 1850. That's when the neighborhood got its name and began to develop. So I'm going to talk about the pre-Torresdale era, then the founding of Torresdale in the 1850s, and then the Morelton Inn era of the 1890s. So those are going to be my three focus areas. And, modern Torresdale is this kind of a sprawling area with a lot of smaller neighborhoods, but historic Torresdale is this very confined area where the Poquessing Creek meets the Delaware River. And that's where Torresdale was founded and developed in its early years. It spread out over the years, but that's where it was founded, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. This is a map of it that, let me see it, that kind of purple curved line, that's Poquessing Creek. And this vertical sort of red line, that's Linden Avenue. And of course, this is the Delaware River. So this area here is historic Torresdale. And again, that's going to be the focus of tonight's talk. I'm hitting the wrong button here. And so the first inhabitants of this area were, of course, the Lenni Lenape, the Native Americans who were here for thousands of years before the Europeans got here. And they had their territorial areas extended up into New York and down into Delaware and New Jersey, the whole Delaware River Valley. And then the Europeans began to arrive in the late 1630s. The first were the Swedes. The Swedes were the first ones to settle, the first Europeans to settle the area that, well, became Philadelphia and Torresdale specifically. They had the colony of New Sweden along the Delaware River. And then for the next 20 some years, the territory went back and forth between different European nations. The Dutch took over from the Swedes, the English took over from the Dutch. And then in 1681, the King of England granted William Penn this charter for what would become Pennsylvania. Penn arrives here in 1682 and establishes Philadelphia and the city of Philadelphia in the province of Pennsylvania. That little blue mark here, that's where Torresdale is in the greater scheme of things here. And this is a detail from that prior map. That map is from 1687. This is detail from that map, and this is the area of Torresdale. And there were a couple of people that owned property here, but it wasn't really populated at all. And then we really start, the development of Torresdale kind of starts in 1735 with Evan Thomas, who is a Quaker miller. He purchases a large tract of land from the Poquessing Creek south along the Delaware River, and he builds a large bake oven, and he begins to sell bread and biscuit to the ships that are plying the Delaware. And there's a wharf, I'll show you in a minute, that a natural wharf that provides easy access. There is a legend that the family provided bread for George Washington's troops during the Revolutionary War. There's no documentary evidence of that. It's just a tradition. It may or may not be true. Here's that natural wharf. This is an aerial view of, a modern aerial view. So you can see how it juts out into the river. So the bakehouse is subdivided and sold to different members of Evan Thomas's family, his sons and others. And then in 1822, George Washington Morgan, who is the son of a Revolutionary War general and named for George Washington, he acquires the bakehouse property. He removes the bake ovens and enlarges and expands the bakehouse, the farmhouse. And we call this Bakehouse 1 because, as you'll see, there's actually 3 bakehouses over the years, over the centuries. And this property basically remains in the Morgan family. People marry into it and descendants inherit it until the 1970s. So like 150 years, it's in the Morgan family. And George Washington Morgan is buried at All Saints Episcopal Church, just up the street here, and as are many other people that we're going to talk about tonight. And also, as Jim well knows, once we get into the 1850s and 60s, almost everybody I'm going to talk about was a member of the Union League at one time. These are all movers and shakers of Philadelphia. So I'm not going to say he was a member and he was a member because it would add like an hour to the talk, I think. So. That was, George Morgan, again, acquired the property in 1822. By 1850, you can see on the left there, the square that says Morgan. Right below that, it's hard to read, but it's Eliza Carolyn Morgan Tesser. She owns the bakehouse property. And then her sister, these are both daughters of Morgan, Harriet Adelaide Morgan, owns a property right above that called Vancouver. And so these are the 2 properties now that are from our descendants of the George Washington Morgan. And then on the right, you see John Risden. He's an important person in Torresdale history. He is a Holmesburg innkeeper and a stagecoach operator, and he buys 110 acres along the Delaware River at the Poquessing Creek, and he builds a hotel and he operates a ferry service back and forth across the Delaware River to New Jersey. And then steamships begin stopping here in the 1840s, going to and from Philadelphia, between Philadelphia and Trenton. So it becomes kind of a transportation hub, but it also becomes a resort, a sporting resort for men. Risden offers boating, hunting, fishing, nature walks, all of that. So young men will come and stay at Risden's hotel for several days and enjoy these outdoor activities. So it sort of becomes a bit of a hub. And Risden is kind of responsible for getting the development, kind of well known. It's not called Torresdale yet. He's also buried at All Saints Cemetery, and he has a pretty major monument, as does George Washington Morgan. Also, during the Risdon's period, the railroad comes through. The Philadelphia to Trenton Railroad runs right through this historic Torresdale, but in the early years, the railroad is really considered a primitive form of transportation. It's very dangerous and uncomfortable and smelly, and so most people do not take the train into the city. Most people are taking the steamships. That's the civilized way to get into the city. And years later, of course, the trains, become better. But in this period, in this early period, the trains were really kind of rough and primitive. So they don't really make a huge difference early on. And all this lays the groundwork for what really becomes the establishment of Torresdale with Charles Macalester, who is a wealthy financier, banker, stockbroker, merchant, advisor to presidents. He purchases 84 acres of John Risdon's property right at the point where the Poquessing meets the Delaware. And he builds a villa at that point that he calls Glengarry. He's of Scottish descent. He names his immediate property Glengarry after his ancestral homeland. He lives in the Risdon's Hotel, which he has purchased while he's building this estate. And this is the only known image of Glengarry, taken from the river. This is the house that eventually becomes Glenford. But when it became Glenford, it got radically renovated. So this is it beforehand, and this is the only known image of it. Glengarry, the residence of Charles Macalester. Now, his immediate property is Glengarry, but he purchased this 84 acres, and he names that larger property Torresdale with an I after his ancestral homeland. And there's a family castle in Scotland. In fact, let me jump ahead here. This is Scotland, the Torresdale Castle, which you can visit. And there it is. It's on an island, off of the west coast. But anyway, he subdivides this larger property, and he begins selling lots to the wealthy and the upper class, his business associates, some family members. He wants this to be kind of an exclusive community. And this really is the birth of Torresdale. He gives it its name, and he begins to develop it. And this map from 1855, a map of Philadelphia, this is the detail. This is the first known published listing of the neighborhood of Torresdale. This is the first time Torresdale appears in print. And what I'm going to talk about in a minute is Macalester begins to sell lots. Below that, the Morgan family is subdividing and expanding and buying and enlarging their property. So these two clans are really the founders of Torresdale. So 1855 was the first published listing of Torresdale. The city directory of 1856, we start to see Torresdale listed. City directories, by the way, they were published every year. They're kind of like phone books before there were phones. So we see James Fisher, Thomas Morgan, William Stewart. These are all gentlemen living in Torresdale with an I. But then the following, or 2 years later, the city directory begins to list Torresdale with an E. And we see Charles Macalester. You see the first address, that's their business address. And then you'll see H, and then Torresdale. H means their home. So the first address is their business, and the second one's their home. So Macalesters, Samuel Grant are listed in Torresdale. Down below, George Carson, Clifford Phillips are listed in Torresdale. So sometimes it's an E, sometimes it's an I. Over time, it becomes an E. It gets standardized to an E. And again, we're going to look at this in terms of the clans or the groups of people. So we have the Morgans, who settled here in the 1820s and begin to expand. Above them is Macalester and the people that he sells to, some family members, some business associates. And then later, like in the 1880s, 90s, the Drexel Morell family come into play and have a huge influence on Torresdale. But again, they're a bit later. We'll get to them in a bit. So here's detail from that 1855 map. You can't see it too well, but these are all the people that Macalester has sold to. He bought the property in 1850, and within 5 years, there's like 6 or 7 different property owners. We're going to look at some of them. So Samuel Grant, who's a merchant, a very wealthy merchant, purchases a property just below Macalester's estate, Glengarry. Glengarry's right at the point where the Poquessing and the Delaware meet. This is the property directly below that. Samuel had visited the Risdon Hotel when he was a young man, so he was familiar with the area. And he and his wife, Cecilia Vezin Grant, purchased this. This is their home. And Grant Avenue is named for them. It's not named for Ulysses S. Grant. It's named for these folks. So just if you remember one thing from tonight, you remember that. If you're familiar with the area, you drive into Glen Ford, and you're entering through the gates on Milner and Grant Avenue. As soon as you enter Glen Ford, the Grant property would be on the right. It's now part of the Glen Ford property, but at that time it was a separate property. Just below them were Samuel Grant's in-laws, the parents of his wife, Charles and Emily Vezin. They're German immigrants. They purchased Risdon's Hotel, and they live there. Again, Macalester had purchased all these properties. They're buying from Macalester. And then sometime in the 1850s, Charles Macalester builds these twin brown stone houses, which are still there. This is a modern picture at what is now Milner Street and Fittler Street. The streets were not named that then, but that's what they're called now. If you go down Fittler Street as if you're going to Glen Ford and you come to the T intersection where you make a left to go to Glen Ford, these two buildings are to your right. And here they are on a later map, listed George Smith and W.R. Brown. So Smith is the Smith family. Major General Thomas Kilby Smith, who was a Civil War general and then became a diplomat, and he worked for the State Department. And his wife Elizabeth, they weren't the first purchasers. Somebody else bought it from Macalester prior to them. They were a later purchaser. Their son later marries into the Drexel family, which we'll talk about. They were Catholic, and they named it St. Helens. This home stays in the Smith family for until the 1950s, around 100 years. And then the property just next to that is known as Birdwood. That's another Civil War soldier, Major William Roll Brown, and his wife, Carolyn Stockton Brown. She's a descendant of Richard Stockton from New Jersey, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. So these two homes, which are still there and beautifully maintained, were ones that Charles Macalester built and sold to, wealthy associates. And then the Hopkins family, which unfortunately we have no images of them or their houses, but they're pretty important. These are nieces and nephews of Charles Macalester. Emily and Fanny are nieces, and Macalester builds a home that is what now Milner and Fittler Streets, and gifts it to them, sells it to them for $1. And they live there with their parents, one of whom is the sister of Charles Macalester. And their brother, Edward Macalester, again, Charles Macalester's nephew, he buys a lot of properties in the area, as we'll see later. Some he purchased from Macalester. He purchased the Risdon Hotel from the Vezins, who had bought it from Macalester. And he's married to Julia Stockton Hopkins, who's the sister of William Roll Brown's wife. So they're all intermarrying with they're all wealthy, well-to-do people. They're all kind of socializing and intermarrying. So here's the Hopkins family holdings in the 1880s. What becomes the Morelton Inn, which was Risdon's hotel, is marked there as well. Some other early purchasers, these again, people that purchased from Macalester: Henry and Mary Farnham, William and Ann McKee. We don't have a picture of them. That's their tombstone. And then Edwin Fittler, who I'm sure Jim can talk about at length. He purchases his property from the McKees, and He owns a very large rope works in Bridesburg. He's the mayor of Philadelphia. And then after that, he's the president of the Union League. He purchases this property from McKee, and he builds this gorgeous estate called Luzon. This is basically at the end of Fittler Street on the Delaware River. If you drive down Fittler Street at the end, it's pretty much there. Just this, spectacular estate. He bought it from the people that bought it from Macalester. So we've looked at the people that Macalester sold to, or the people that bought from the people he sold to. So that's like the first clan, the people that are creating Torresdale from Macalester. But down below that, of course, we have the Morgans, and they've begun to expand as well. We saw earlier, that the Morgan property was divided into the Bakehouse and Vancouver. Now, this is 1870s map. Those two estates are still there, but in between we have these other estates. These are all descendants, again, of George Washington Morgan. And these are all the people, James Fisher, William Hood Stewart, George Carson, Nelson Brown. Jim, are they all members probably? Yeah, I think they're all members. All of these properties that we're about to look at are now Delaware Landing and Baker's Bay, the gated condominium communities along the river. Some of the building, not their home, not the beautiful homes, but some of the buildings from their outbuildings from their homes have survived, which I'll talk about. So there's the Bakehouse, which is now owned by James and Mary Fisher. Mary's the granddaughter of George Washington Morgan. The Bakehouse burns down in late 1865. It makes the New York Times, does an article, destruction of an historical relic, the old bakehouse on the Delaware burn. So this is big news, right? The New York Times is reporting it. The Fishers build a new home, which they call Bakehouse 2. And this is an 1880s photo of it. Again, it was built in the 1860s. I'm going to jump out of historical era here for a minute, just for continuity, because there's a Bakehouse 3. And what happens is Walter George Phillips in the 1940s, who's a very prominent civic leader, he's a descendant of the Morgans. He inherits the property, Bakehouse 2. It's too big and old and difficult to heat and maintain, so he has it demolished, and he has Bakehouse 3 built, which is a modern building. It's designed by Edmund Bacon and Oscar Stonerov. If you know anything about architecture, these are the two major mid-20th century Philadelphia architects. And they built it with stones from Bakehouse 2. This is still here. This is the administrative offices and the clubhouse for Delaware Landing. So that it's kind of a remnant of what goes back to really colonial times. So here are the three bakehouses, 1, 2, and 3. The one is colonial, the other is mid-19th century, and the other is mid-20th century. Moving up from Bakehouse, we have the estate of William Hood Stewart, La Carolinita. He is a wealthy sugar baron. He has plantations in Cuba. He marries Ellen Morgan, who's the granddaughter of the original George Washington Morgan. He's a collector and a connoisseur of fine art. He moves to Paris. He dies there, but they bring him back, and he's buried also at All Saints Church up the street. This is La Carolinita. These were gorgeous estates right on the river. Unfortunately, they're all gone. The next estate up is Rose Cottage, George Carson. We don't have a photo of him. He was also involved in the sugar trade. He also marries a granddaughter of George Washington Morgan. He purchases the land from his mother-in-law, and he builds Rose Cottage. And he's known for his extensive gardens and arbors. And this is Rose Cottage, again, right on the river. And then the next property up is Vancouver, which has existed since at least 1850, Nelson Brown, and it's written Nielsen, but we have it on good authority. My wife, Patty, tracked down, I don't know if this is great-granddaughter, I think that, I'll have to confirm with either his granddaughter or great-granddaughter. I said, it's pronounced Nelson. which we had heard, but we now have confirmation. He's an heir to the Brown Brothers banking fortune. You ever heard of Brown Brothers Harriman, right? He's an heir to them. His parents have a home in Torresdale. Alexander Brown, also a very wealthy man. Their home is on what became Linden Avenue, kind of where the Torresdale Boys Club and the Torresdale Playground is. If anybody knows the area, that's where his parents had. He marries the great-granddaughter of George Morgan and the daughter of his next-door neighbor, George Carson, and he purchases Vancouver from them and lives there with his wife, but then he well, it's a long story, but now there's a river road, so these houses are right on the river, and there's a road going along the river with these gates. But from what we learned is the gates were never closed because everybody was related to each other. They were all family, so they just left the gates open. But this is the gate between the Carson Rose Cottage and the Brown Estate, Vancouver. This is Vancouver. And again, that's no longer survives either, but he's an avid equestrian, known for his tally-ho, the four-in-hand, the ornate carriages that you drive with 4 horses. And in 1876, he builds this elaborate stable, which my wife, Patty, I know I keep bringing her up, but she deserves it, she discovered was most likely designed by Frank Furness, the famous Philadelphia architect. This is a 1883 view of Nelson Brown's stable, most likely designed by Frank Furness. Here's an 1893 view of him in front of the stable on his carriage. And this is the building today. It's the clubhouse and offices for Baker's Bay, the other gated condominium community. So Delaware Landing, the gated condominium community, say that fast, just below has the Bakehouse 3 as its clubhouse, and then Baker's Bay, the other gated community, has the Nelson Brown Stable as its clubhouse. So at least we have those buildings surviving, although they're private. They're not open to the public. You have to have to be a resident to get in. Although sometimes we give a fake name and sneak in there at the gate, but we've done that several times. So we've looked now at the Morgan clan, right? All the people that descended from and married into the Morgan family from 1820s. We also looked at the Macalester clan, right? The people that bought from or secondarily bought from Charles Macalester, who started there in 1850. We're going to circle back one more time to the Macalester clan because Charles Macalester and his son die in 1873. His daughter, Lily Macalester Lawton, who's a Washington, D.C. socialite, she maintains the property as a summer home until her death in 1891. And then 4 years later, the property is purchased by Robert Forderer, who owns a large leather works in Frankfurt. He's a U.S. congressman, also sort of a civic leader, and he purchases Glengarry in 1895, and he renames it Glen Ford. He takes the Glen from Glengarry and the Ford from his name, Forderer, and he comes up with Glen Ford, and that's what it's still known as today. He undertakes, let me go back. He undertakes a huge renovation of it, but unfortunately he dies before it's completed, so he never really gets to see or live in it. But this is Glen Ford today. It's the last remaining riverfront, Delaware riverfront historic estate that's open to the public. It's owned by the city, the Fairmount Park and the Parks and Rec Department, and managed by the Glen Ford Conservation Corporation. So again, we've looked at the Macalester clan and their properties. We've looked at the Morgan clan and their properties. These are all the people that really built Torresdale. Now we're going to switch over to the Drexel Morell clan that comes in a little later in the 1890s. And that's these folks. And it starts with Francis Drexel, another wealthy banker. I that's the word that's sort of seems to be the key phrase for this talk. A banker and financier. You've heard of Drexel Brothers and Lambert, and his brother A.J. Drexel is the founder of Drexel University. In 1870, he purchases a 90-acre farm at Knights and Red Line Road, a little kind of in this different section of Torresdale, as a summer home for his family. He engages the noted architect Addison Hutton to renovate it and expand it. They're devout Catholics. They name the estate San Michel after the patron saint of his father-in-law, Michel Bouvier, who is an ancestor of Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. So we've got some serious connections there. The Drexel and Morell marries into the family. Their properties are not in what I'm calling historic Torresdale on the lower left there. Their properties are up on the right there. The Drexel estate, as we'll see, is now part of Jefferson Torresdale Hospital, and the Morell estate is now Morell Park. This is just right up the street here. So Francis Drexel has two wives. His first wife dies. He marries again. And between the two of them, he has three daughters, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Louise. And they live here at San Michel, the home that he bought and had renovated into a summer home. This is San Michel now, still there. It's now part of the campus of Jefferson Torresdale Hospital. In the 1920s, the family builds Francis is long gone, but his daughters build this chapel. They're all devout Catholics, which is called the Shrine of the True Cross. This is also on the hospital campus. This is the building we're going to visit as part of our Northeast Philadelphia History Group on September 7th, if you want to come see it. And here are the two buildings as part of the hospital campus. If you ever have to go to the emergency room at this hospital, you drive right by these buildings, and I've had to do it many times, unfortunately, so I'm familiar. But so now the first Drexel, the oldest Drexel daughter, Elizabeth, she marries Walter George Smith. He's the son of that General Kilby Smith who purchased one of those two brownstones I was talking about before. He marries into that family. Or, I mean, he's from that family. He marries into the Drexel family. The couple goes on their honeymoon, and they're coming back to live at San Michel, that Drexel summer home. And Elizabeth is having complications from pregnancy, and she and the baby die in childbirth there at San Michel. Walter moves back to the family home and never remarries, and has this long career as a very prominent Catholic attorney. And this is the home. Again, I showed you this before. It's one of those two brownstones that Macalester built in the 1850s. They called it St. Helens. He lived there for the rest of his life. In 1924, I think he died. And the family stays, the house stays in the Smith family until the 1950s. The second Drexel daughter, Catherine, founds a religious order of nuns, focusing specifically on Native Americans and African Americans. She's ministering to them. The order was originally based at San Michel, again, the family summer home, and then it moves to that grand place in Andalusia up the street, but they maintain a presence at San Michel for many years. Again, now the hospital. She's canonized a saint in 2000, so she's Saint Catherine Drexel. And then the youngest Drexel daughter, Louise, she marries Edward de Veaux Morell. He's the son of Ida Powell. If you know anything about Philadelphia history, the Powell family, Powelton Village is named after them. They're very, very important both in the colonial and the federal period. Samuel Powell and the Powell House and Society Hill, which is a great preserved, federal period house. So Edward Morell's mother's side traces back to that. She gets, I can't remember, she gets divorced or her husband dies. I think her husband dies. I'll have to check with my wife. But his stepfather is the very famous attorney, Philadelphia attorney, John G. Johnson. If you know the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the John G. Johnson collection is essentially the collection that started the museum. So he's Edward Morell comes from great wealth. His wife comes from great wealth. Together, they're fabulously wealthy. They purchase a property near San Michele that they call San Jose. And this is San Jose. This has not survived after Louise dies. It becomes developed. It's now Morell Park, this neighborhood just like less than a mile from here. So Edward and Louise or especially Edward, is a very prominent Torresdale civic leader, politician, landowner. They're both very active in Catholic charities and specifically supporting their sister-in-law, Catherine Drexel's religious order. Edward dies in 1917. Louise stays at San Jose until her death in 1945, and it's after that it gets developed into Morell Park, that property. So I'm going to talk about now, Edward Morell basically buys all of historic Torresdale. I showed you a version of this map earlier from the 1880s. Remember the Hopkins family? They were the nieces and nephews of Charles Macalester, the founder of Torresdale. They own a whole bunch of properties. And then Henry Bory, another wealthy merchant and banker, owns a number of properties. And this is in the 1880s. 7 years later, Edward Morell owns almost all of it. These are all Morell properties circled here. And the only one he didn't buy really was, well, here's a couple he didn't buy, but the main one he never did buy was Glengarry, which is Charles Macalester's estate, still owned by his daughter, who's still alive at this point. Oh, no, she was dead, but it was her estate. Yeah. Anyway, Edward Morell, I can't imagine how he accomplished everything he did in his short life. He was an attorney, he was a colonel and a general in the PA National Guard. He's generally referred to as Colonel Morell. He was a city councilman, a U.S. congressman, a member of the Philadelphia Board of Education. That's his like national and Philadelphia life. In Torresdale specifically, he established the first phone line north of Frankfurt. He builds the first electric plant in the Northeast. He adds the area of roads paved. He owns a racetrack near his family's estate, San Michele. He owns the Upper Delaware Transportation Company, a steamship line. He's a founding member of this organization, the Torresdale Country Club, and then he owns the Morelton Inn, which we're going to talk about. So he did a lot. Here's the Upper Delaware River Transportation Company. They had 3 steamships that plied the Delaware, and again, he was the main owner of that. And then he develops the Morelton Inn, and so he purchases that property. Remember, now this is the Risdon had established a hotel on this site in the 1830s. Charles Macalester's nephew, Edward Hopkins, bought the property, demolished Risdon's hotel, and built a new home, which then gets transformed into the Morelton Inn. The Hopkins home, I guess, was probably in the 1850s or 60s sometime. But here in the newspapers in 1892, it's talking about this new resort that Edward Morell is building. He purchased and renovates Edward Hopkins' home on the original Risdon Hotel site, and he's going to create this Morelton Inn. The work begins in April. On the left there's a notice about you can rent rooms and cottages and at this new resort it's taking shape. The grand opening is June 13th, 1892. This is the Philadelphia Times on the left announcing a new pleasure park. Over 1,000 gentlemen active in politics, commercial, and social circles spend a pleasant day at Mr. Morell's beautiful palace. So this was like, a high-class place to be. This is where all the movers and shakers are gathering at Morell's place, and he himself is one of the big movers and shakers. So what you can do at the Morelton, there's dining and dancing, there's boating and hunting and fishing. You can sit and watch boats on the river. You can stroll these beautiful, luxurious grounds that he's developed. You can play lawn tennis. You can take carriage rides. You could rent cottages, rent them for a few days, for a few weeks, rent them for the season. It becomes a really fashionable resort. Here are some of the outbuildings or the cottages that you could rent. The Riverside Cottage Annex on the left, that was formerly Samuel Grant's house, one of the first houses built after Macalester took over. So that was one of the houses you can build. On the upper right, a number of lawnside cottages were built throughout the area because Morell had purchased all these properties and sort of consolidated a lot of them into this resort, the grounds of this resort. On the right is lower right is another building that was an outbuilding. That's now the Delaware River Yacht Club, so that's still there. The other buildings are not there. And here he built a fashionable boat landing because he's having people come up on the steamship line that he owns, right? He's bringing them up, and they're unloading there at the wharf at the landing. And this is the landing. This is Fittler Street extending to the Delaware River. This is where you would get off the boat and to arrive at the Morelton Inn. On the left, a grand concert is to be given by the Morelton Inn Orchestra in August. And on the right, arrivals at the Morelton Inn. It lists all the fashionable people who are arriving in August at the Morelton Inn. At the top of the list there, if you can see it, the second and third line, Mr. and Mrs. Hamilton Diston. Hamilton Diston is inherited the Diston Saw Works, the world's largest saw works, from his father in Tacony. He's a major player in Philadelphia politics and a major businessman. So he's at the top of the list. But all down here are all these prominent people who are coming to the Morelton, for rest and relaxation. One of the big events was in June of 1894, the Great Intercollegiate Boat Race. And this is a print of the Great Intercollegiate Boat Race passing the Morelton Inn. It's the University of Pennsylvania versus Cornell, and Cornell wins. There was also a casino on the property. These are photos of the casino. My wife did a lot of research in tracking this down, and we finally determined that it's this building, which is at Grant and Wissinoming Streets, basically across Grant Avenue from Glen Ford. That white tower there was added later, but this is the casino building. And some of you here might know Tony Radwatsky, who was a kind of a civic leader and worked for the Philadelphia city government for many years. He and his wife lived here. He died a few years ago. I think she still lives there. But that house was the casino. Now, all of this only lasts for 6 years. Edward Morell is like really busy. He's going to be a congressman, and starting in 1900, and he's had so many things going on. So he kind of bows out, and a couple of different entities try to run the Morelton. He still owns it, but he's not actively managing it. So other people are now managing it, but it's not very successful. And then in 1898, it's taken over by a private club. So in the Philadelphia Inquirer says the property of the Morelton Inn was secured, and a club organized by about 100 persons prominent in the city. The house itself is a fine old brownstone mansion built by Edward Hopkins in the antebellum days, and to this numerous additions have been made. So this private club, it's called the Morelton Club, but it's now like a private club, right? It's not a public place that anybody could go to, as it was when it was the Morelton Inn. So it's the Morelton Club. And then in 1917, Edward Morell dies. He is having health issues, and he goes out to Colorado to recuperate, and he dies there kind of suddenly. I mean, he was unhealthy, but everybody thought he was improving, but then he took a turn for the worst. And so the Inquirer says, Colonel Edward Morell, former congressman and one of Philadelphia's most prominent citizens and well-known throughout the country, died Saturday night. He was only 54 years old. How he accomplished all those things in 54 years is beyond me. But his widow, Louise Drexel Morell, begins to sell off the properties, the Morelton Inn properties over the years. And then in 1923, she sells, the Morelton Inn expansive grounds. She's selling off all the parts of it. And then she sells the actual Morelton property to this couple, Francis and Mary Teresa Thron, stipulating that the proceeds go to Cardinal Dennis Doherty, the Archbishop of Philadelphia. Again, very religious, the Drexels and the Morells. They give tremendous amounts of money to the Catholic Church. So the proceeds go to the Archdiocese. The Throns try to make a go of the Morelton Inn, but it doesn't really go. And I'm wrapping up here. So here is it goes through several owners and several uses. Here is a real estate brochure from the 1940s advertising the sale of this spectacular property. And in 1948, it's bought by Willem and Virginia Nauer. He is a Pennsylvania Deputy Attorney General. She's very prominent in Philadelphia politics, the first Republican woman that served on Philadelphia City Council. She served as a chief consumer advisor to Presidents Nixon, Ford, and Reagan. She's the first person to hold the office of consumer advocate. Here she is with Nixon. There was a property up in Croydon, Bucks County called China Hall, an 18th century property that was due to be demolished. And the Nauers purchased all the interior woodwork and finishings and have them installed at their home, Morelton. And so this is the Morelton Inn, now a private home. And this is the Nauers in that home. And here are the interior finishings. It's really spectacular. A number of us had the opportunity to tour this recently. And it's a private home, now called Morelton Manor. It's really, really spectacular. And then I just want to end with just up the street, like basically it's, next door, is Glen Ford, which is also a spectacular estate, both the grounds and the mansion. That's Glen Ford on the left there, the white building. And I like to end with this slide because this is how it really all begins. This is the Poquessing Creek where it empties into the Delaware River, Glen Ford there, right at the point. This is where Charles Macalester built Glengarry, and before that, John Risdon established his hotel. And it's this inner section of the waterways that really is what drives the whole development of Torresdale. So I like to end with that slide because that kind of gives the reason that it all happened. So that's the whirlwind tour of Torresdale history. So,
Jack, that was fantastic.
All right. I can exhale now.
Seriously, Jack, that was really, that was wonderful. Thanks. All right, so it's Q&A, but Q means question. So
I'm gonna call my wife.
Right. So, so does anybody have any questions for Jack about anything? I'd
like to ask about this specific property.
Okay.
So the specific property that we're on right now, how does it tie into all that you were talking about?
So I forget the dates again. This is, my wife would know this off the top of her head. The Frankfurt Country Club down in Frankfurt was open in the early 1900s. And then that area began to get developed. And so they entered into an agreement. A bunch of people, including Edward Morell, established the Torresdale Country Club. And its original headquarters was across Grand Avenue up the road a little bit. And then they merged with the Frankfurt Country Club to create the Torresdale Frankfurt Country Club and occupied this building. What I don't know is when this building was built and when they actually occupied it. I'm sorry, I don't have those specific dates, but that's how it happened.
It was 1896 when the Torresdale group got together and created Torresdale Country Club.
Okay, so wait, hold on. We want to make sure that people out in Zoom land hear you. So somebody's going to hand you a microphone. This gentleman knows the history here.
So it was 1896 when the founders, in December of 1896, they got together and formed the Torresdale Country Club.
And Edward Morell was one of those founders.
Yeah, and right. So was the Drexel folks with St. Catherine's, ancestors.
Right.
So and then afterwards in 1919 we bought this property here. We were further away, and then hired Donald Ross, who did the plans, and then we merged with the Frankfurt Country Club, who lost their property to the city.
Right.
And that finally went through after a bunch of litigation in 1922
Okay. Well,
in Torresdale, Frankfurt.
thank you. Well, somebody knows the history.
All right. Anybody else? Well, think hard. Got to have some questions.
One question, two questions. Okay. One question. Here's another one.
I'm just curious. I see that nunnery plot there.
Ah, yes, that's Eden Hall, which was established, I think, in the 1840s, maybe, as a religious order. It was a convent, and then it became a home for girls. And one of the nuns there was a Bouvier, related to Jacqueline Kennedy. Yeah, so that I get again. I don't remember the exact year, but the Eden Hall was there, until it burned down a few years ago. It's now Fleur Park and Eden Hall Park. Yeah,
I think it eventually became a girls' high school, Catholic girls' high school.
Yeah, it was a girls'
private
school.
Yeah.
And then St. Catherine of Siena Catholic Parish, which is just up the street here, well, actually across the street, was established in 1922 as a Catholic parish. And before they built their school in the 1960s, where I actually went to school, they sent their kids the kids were educated at Eden Hall until the school was built in 1962, I think, 61. Yeah.
All right. Anybody? Good stuff. Anybody else? Just out of curiosity, how many people live, like, say, within 5 miles of here? I mean, how many of you are Torresdalians?
Torresdalians?
I had to call them something. I know it's like, but okay, just kind of wondering. Yeah. So okay, just wondering. All right. So
wow, I got off easy with the questions.
Yeah. So Jack, thank you very, very much again for a spectacular program.
My pleasure.
That was really good. And please thank Patty for us as well.
Yeah.
All right. So folks, again, thank you all for coming out this evening. We appreciate it. You braved the weather, and it turned out to be pretty nice after all. So thank you. I know many of you are staying for dinner, which is wonderful, and we'll see some of you around. So again, thanks for everything, and stay well, everybody.